John 7:13. Nemo tamen palam loquebatur de illo propter metum Judaeorum. And no one was speaking openly concerning him on account of fear of Jews. Here we're continuing to hear about Jesus' presence at the feast, at the festival. And we begin with a wonderful word, Nemo, which we've talked about before, mostly indeclinable, if that is not an oxymoron like saying very unique or something like that. Mostly indeclinable Nemo in the sense that really only two variations are commonly found. Nemini in the dative case and neminem in the accusative case. And other forms are actually supplied by another word altogether. In the ablative case, instead, we use nullo, and in the genitive singular, nullius, to express the same thing as nemo in the nominative. Just a little note there in case you encounter this word in your Latin readings. So, in addition, or nevertheless, no one was speaking, loquebatur, and here we have the imperfect tense. This is third person singular, imperfect indicative, referring back to Nemo, which is the subject. No one person was speaking openly about him. And notice Latin is very careful here to put a singular verb with a singular subject. And actually we do this same thing in English, even if we're thinking of a large group of people, no one of whom is doing something. We preserve that singular sense and we say no one cares, when really we mean none of this whole group of people. All of these people perhaps are uncaring, to put it another way. So Latin is like English, quite precise in this sense. Nemo loquebatur. The imperfect here, we have to remember, as always, has the sense of incomplete, unfinished action. It might be worth noting here for you to remember that sometimes also, not in this context, but in other contexts, the imperfect can be equivalent to something like English used to do something. People used to do this or that action repeatedly in the past. But that's not what we've got here. We've got just one time that we're thinking of, but we're representing this action as ongoing in the past or unfinished in the context of other things that are happening. So no one, nevertheless, was speaking openly. And for palam here, we could substitute other words. The 16th century humanist Erasmus actually suggests libere, freely, which makes it a little bit more plain for us English speakers. Other words are possible as well. And remember, we contrasted this word in an earlier verse with adverbs which mean the opposite, like clam, that is, or secretly or privately, clandestinely, something like that. And who is nobody talking openly about? Well, nobody is talking openly about Jesus. Deillo. Nobody is speaking about him or concerning him. And why? The reason is given in the succeeding words, on account of the fear of the Jews. Now, this is an optimal opportunity, not only to talk about words for fear. We've got metus, but also timor. We might also think of formido or even pavor. These are all synonyms for fear that are good to know. You'll certainly encounter them in different texts. But we also can remark on the fact that Judaeorum here is what we call an objective genitive. That is, as opposed to a subjective genitive. What's the difference between these things? Well, it's pretty easy to illustrate with a couple of examples. So what we're talking about here is a certain ambiguity in the use of the genitive, and it's an ambiguity that occurs in English as well as Latin for that matter. But we could look at a phrase like odium Caesaris and say, well, what does this mean? This means the hatred of Caesar. But already we can hear something has not been quite totally decided by our ears. Is it hatred for Caesar or Caesar's hatred of others? who exactly is doing the hating. Similarly, we could use a phrase like amor patris and say, does this mean the love of a father, e.g. for his children, or does it mean the love of the children for the father? In other words, is the word in the genitive case the subject of the loving, the one who is doing the loving, the one who possesses the loving, or the one who is the object or the target of the loving or the hating or whatever word we want to use? So we have that same ambiguity, theoretically at least. I think the context does make it clear, but theoretically we have an ambiguity here. Metum Judaeorum. Does metus Judaeorum mean the fear that the Jews feel towards others, or the fear in this passage that others fear toward the Jews? Really, Judaeorum here refers to the Jewish leaders, since almost everyone we're talking about in this context, of course, strictly speaking, is Jewish. Is it fear of the Jewish leaders towards others, or others' fear of the Jewish leaders? We know that it's the latter from context here, but it's just worth dwelling on that when we get these genitives, especially with words of emotion and feeling or disposition, we've got to ask ourselves, are we accounting for the different possibilities of interpretation here?